over 700,000 casualties, for almost no ground. Entire villages erased, never rebuilt. Land so destroyed it is still unsafe today. This wasn't just a battle, it was a war of endurance, a test of how much a nation could suffer before it broke. This was Verdun, a place where the idea of warfare itself seemed to collapse under its own weight, where every metre gained came at an unimaginable cost. Even today, walking through the remnants of the battlefield, the silence feels heavy, as if the land itself remembers what happened here. Generationally long damage and scarring, life-lasting detrimental trauma, artillery barrages, chemical warfare, and this is only the beginning of one of modern history's most brutal battles. Verdun. It's 1916. Europe has already been engulfed in the nightmare of World War I. For nearly 2 years, across the Western Front, armies are locked in trench warfare, a static war of attrition where movement is measured in yards rather than miles. Soldiers live in narrow trenches, carved into mud, knee-deep in filth, surrounded by rats, lice, disease, and the constant stench of decay. Every day is a cycle of fear, boredom, and sudden violence. Artillery shells fall without warning, sometimes shaking the ground for miles. Men no longer expect survival, only rotation out or replacement. And in many places along the front, even that expectation begins to fade. The German Chief of Staff, Erich von Fackelheim, devises a plan codenamed Operation Gutierrez. His goal is not to capture Paris or advance deep into France, but to destroy the French army itself through a battle of attrition. The idea is brutally simple. Force the French to defend a symbolic location so important that they will be willing to bleed endlessly for it, and then grind them down under overwhelming artillery fire. Fackelheim believed that if France suffered enough casualties, it would bleed white and collapse under the weight of its own losses. In his calculations, victory would come not through movement, but through exhaustion, through breaking human endurance itself. But why Verdun? Some might ask why Germany did not aim directly for Paris or a larger strategic city. The answer lies in Verdun, symbolic importance. Verdun was not just a town or a fortress, it was a historic stronghold of France, heavily fortified and deeply tied to national pride. It represented centuries of French military identity, standing as a guardian of the eastern frontier. To lose Verdun would not just be a military defeat, but a physiological collapse.
Even more than that, Verdun carried emotional weight. Generations of French soldiers had trained to defend this region. It had resisted past invasions, including during the Franco-Prussian War of 1870 to 1871. For the French, it symbolized endurance, survival, and national honor. This idea was captured in the famous French slogan, "On ne passe pas," they shall not pass. It was more than propaganda. It was a promise that France would hold its ground no matter the cost. And as tensions built in early 1916, both sides understood something important. Verdun was not just a battlefield anymore, it was a test of national will. Verdun also sat within a heavily fortified sector, surrounded by forts and defensive positions that made it appear nearly impenetrable. But this strength also made it attractive to Falkenhayn. If Germany could break Verdun, it would prove that no French position was truly safe, and perhaps more importantly, it would force France into a battle it could not easily escape. On February 21st, 1916, the plan was unleashed. The German Fifth Army opened with a massive artillery bombardment lasting around 10 hours. Over 1,200 German guns fired nearly 2 million shells into the French positions. The sky over Verdun became a storm of fire and smoke. Trees were obliterated, trenches collapsed instantly. The entire defensive positions were erased within minutes. Soldiers described it not as explosions, but as a continuous wave, as if the ground itself was being erased layer by layer. There was no real front line in the traditional sense anymore, just destruction. Following this, German stormtrooper units were deployed. These were specially trained assault groups designed for speed and infiltration. Instead of large, slow-moving waves of infantry, stormtroopers moved in small, fast units, often equipped with grenades and flamethrowers. The job was to exploit gaps created by artillery and push rapidly into weakened positions. This tactic allowed German forces to gain approximately 3.1 miles in just a few days, an extraordinary advance by World War I standards. Yet even this success came at a cost. Every metre forward was still paid for in lives, fear, and exhaustion. By February 25th, German troops captured Fort Douaumont, the most powerful and heavily fortified structure in the Verdun sector. Its fall sent shockwaves through for France. Remarkably, the fort had been poorly manned at the time of the attack, taken almost by accident rather than direct assault, but its capture still represented a massive psychological blow. For many French soldiers, it felt like the first crack in a system that was supposed to be unbreakable. The French response, however, was not collapse, but determination. General Philippe Pétain was placed in command of the French defense. Recognizing that Verdun had to be held at all costs, he recognized the entire defensive structure. One of his most important decisions was the creation of a troop rotation system, meaning that nearly 75% of the entire French army would pass through Verdun at some point. This ensured that no single unit would be completely destroyed, but it also meant Verdun became a shared national experience of suffering, a place where almost every French family would eventually have someone who fought there. Another critical innovation was the establishment of a single supply route known as the Voie Sacrée, or Sacred Way. This road, running from Bar-le-Duc, became the lifeline of Verdun. Day and night, thousands of vehicles moved along it, delivering ammunition, food, reinforcements, and medical supplies. At its peak, around 6,000 vehicles a day traveled this route, keeping the French defense alive despite constant German attempts to cut it off. The road itself became as important as the battlefield, a narrow artery keeping an entire army functioning under pressure. As the battle dragged on, Verdun transformed into something almost unrecognizable. Soldiers began calling it the Hell of Verdun. The landscape itself was destroyed beyond recognition, reduced to craters, broken trees, and shattered fortifications. Key positions such as La Mort, Holm, meaning Dead Man's Hill, and Hill 304 became focal points of brutal back-and-forth fighting. These locations changed hands repeatedly, sometimes within the same day, with neither side able to maintain a lasting advantage. Soldiers often describe the feeling of fighting in these areas as surreal, as if time itself had stopped, leaving only destruction and repetition. In June 1916, German forces captured Fort Vaux after a prolonged and desperate siege. The defenders inside held out under extreme conditions, with water running out and communications collapsing. The fortress became a symbol of French resistance, even in defeat. Shortly after, German troops reached their closest point to Verdun itself, coming within just 2.5 miles of the citadel. At this stage, however, the German army was exhausted. Supply lines were stretched, casualties were rising, and the offensive was beginning to lose momentum. The very strategy designed to break France was now beginning to strain Germany itself. At the same time, a massive new battle was unfolding further northwest, the Battle of the Somme. On July 1st, 1916, British and French forces launched a major offensive against German positions. This forced Germany to divert troops away from Verdun, relieving pressure on the French defenders. The interconnected nature of the Western Front meant that no battle existed in isolation. Each one influenced the others, like pressure shifting across a collapsing system. Taking advantage of this shift, the French launched a major counter-offensive under General Robert Nivelle in August 1916. Supported by heavy artillery bombardments, French forces began pushing German troops back from their advanced positions. Fort Douaumont was recaptured on October 24th, followed by Fort Vaux on November 2nd. By mid-December, the French had launched a final push that drove German forces almost back to their original positions from February. After nearly 10 months of continuous combat, the battle finally slowed. Verdun had become one of the longest and most brutal battles of World War I, lasting over 300 days. It is often described as a mincing machine or bone mill, a place where entire divisions were consumed for only meters of land. Millions of artillery shells had been fired, turning the landscape into a cratered, lunar-like wasteland. Even in victory, there was no sense of triumph, only survival. Chemical weapons were also used extensively by both sides, including phosgen and other toxic gases that caused slow and painful injuries. The environment itself became as deadly as the fighting. Forests were destroyed, villages vanished completely, and entire regions were rendered uninhabitable. 9 villages were so completely obliterated that they were never rebuilt and officially declared died for France. In total, the battle resulted in roughly 700 to 800,000 casualties, with around 300,000 soldiers killed. But beyond the numbers, Verdun became a symbol of suffering on an industrial scale. It demonstrated how World War I had transformed warfare into something mechanized, relentless, and deeply human in its costs. It also raised a haunting question that still echoes through history. When does a battle stop being about victory and become only about survival? Even today, the land around Verdun remains scarred. Certain areas are still considered dangerous due to unexploded shells and contamination, preserved as red zones where nature has only partially reclaimed the battlefield. Walking there, you are not just looking at history, you're looking at something unfinished. So with all this, Verdun stands not just as a military engagement, but as one of the most defining battles of the First World War, a place where strategy, symbolism, and suffering collided on an unimaginable scale, and where neither victory nor defeat could be measured in simple terms. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe for more history content, and let me know in the comments, do you think Germany could have changed the outcome of Verdun if they had chosen a different strategy? Or was the battle always destined to become a stalemate of endurance?